In the last video, I talked about what a function was, as well as describing functions with words. Now I want to look at using tables and graphs to describe functions. Let's start with the idea of tables with functions. A table will have inputs on the left and corresponding outputs on the right. So we tend to just write the words inputs and outputs. We can put a line through the middle. And then we just go ahead and list some inputs and their corresponding outputs. In the last video, I gave an example of a function where we input a person and output their height. So maybe we input Adam. And Adam is 164 centimeters. If we input Beth, she is 157 centimeters. And if we input Cody, maybe Cody is 161 centimeters. So this would be an example of a function table. What about function graphs? Not all functions are going to have graphs. In order to graph a function, both our inputs and our outputs need to be numbers. For a graph, the first coordinate of a point is the input, and the second coordinate of that point is going to be the corresponding output. So let's look at an example. Let's suppose we planted a seed, and every day for the first 12 days, we measured the height of this plant. So our inputs are the number of days since we have planted the seed, and the output would be our height. So I want to graph this. Our inputs were the number of days, so this will go on our x-axis, the horizontal axis. The y-axis, or the vertical axis, will be our outputs, which is the plant height measured in inches. On day 0, the height was 0. On day 1, the height was 0. Day 2, day 3, and day 4, it was all 0. On day 5, it was 1/2. Day 6 was 1.5. Day 7 was 3. Day 8 was 5. 9 was 5.5. Day 10 was 6, and then 11 and 12 were also 6. And from there, we just start connecting these points with, in this case, I'm going to do line segments. So we just slowly connect the dots, and once we do, we have the graph of this particular function, which is the function of the plant growth. Here I have a situation. At the beginning of the week, the pollen count rose sharply. Later in the week, the pollen count continued to rise, but more slowly. And I want to look at building a graph of this situation. For this particular function, I'm going to let time be my input, and my output will be the pollen count, how much pollen there actually is. So we know that it's rising, hence this word right here, rose. In particular, it rose sharply. So what that tells me is that we need it to be very, very steep at the beginning of the week. It still continued to rise, but this time more slowly. So now, later in the week, we should have it as less steep. So when we draw this, we need it very steep at the beginning of the week, and then we need it to slow down, although still increasing since it continued to rise, but now not as steep of an increase. So this would be a graph that describes this situation. This time, my situation says the pollen count fell steadily during the week. So once again, I'm going to graph, and I'm going to put time on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis will be pollen count. And this time it fell. So our graph should be going down, and it fell steadily, which means it should be going down at the same rate. So it should essentially be a line. The steepness of the line we don't really know. We don't know if it is a very sharp, steady drop or not. But this is one graph that would describe this situation. This time, at the beginning of the week, the pollen count fell slowly. Later in the week, the pollen count fell more rapidly. So just like my last two examples, I'm going to put time on the horizontal axis and pollen count on the vertical axis. So we know it fell slowly at the beginning, which means it should be not a steep drop, but it should be dropping. Later in the week, it fell more rapidly, so we should be getting steeper as we go on. So we have an initial pollen count. We need it to go down slowly. So we have an initial pollen count. We need it to go down slowly and then slowly get more and more rapid. So we need it to slowly get steeper and steeper. So something like this.